This is special coverage of the oral arguments in Scott Peterson's appeal. We're planning to jump live in the California Supreme Court under an hour. Under an hour, we're going to keep our eyes open, and you're going to hear arguments from the defense, responses from the prosecution, and all of it's about is whether or not this guy you see right here, is he going to get a new trial as to his conviction and a new trial as to his sentence? That becomes the question. And there's a lot on the line here. But before we even get into more of the arguments, we're going back to the evidence that we did here, things that we did here throughout this whole case. As we know, this man had an affair with Amber Fry. She ended up cooperating with police, recording her phone calls with Scott Peterson. And eventually he does come clean to the fact that he has a wife, that she's missing after he said he wasn't married, and that was not the case. While he does end up talking to her and confessing to her, and in this January 6, 2003 recorded conversation, you'll hear her pressing him about what happened to Lacey.
There's no question you are so much better.
Yeah, and I deserve to understand an explanation of why you told me you'd lost your wife and this was the first holidays you'd spend without her. That was December 9th. You told me this, and now all of a sudden your wife's missing? Are you kidding me? Did you hear me?
I did. I gotta come out of space.
Of course you couldn't tell me the story about your wife because it hadn't happened yet. And you were hoping to resolve in January that it'd be resolved and you'd have a story to tell me.
You think I had something to do with her disappearance? Ever you believe that?
Well, let's see. How can I believe that? How can I believe that? How could I believe anything for...
I am not evil like that.
I would hope not.
I am... Oh, my God.
You've lied to me now?
So the question becomes, how would he have done this? Joseph, I want to turn to you. Big piece of evidence that came up was the idea that Scott Peterson created these anchors made out of cement, and that he used these anchors to submerge the body of Lacey. Now, your opinion upon that, because the prosecution said, well, we only found one, he must have used the others to sink Lacey. But there's this competing evidence, I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that these anchors really couldn't have sunk the body. I mean, where do we stand on the anchors?
It's very difficult to determine this. I think a lot of it is speculative at best, because the dynamic of a body in a very harsh environment like the Bay, the dynamic of the decompositional event is going to compromise the structural integrity of the body. So if the body is moored in some way by one or two anchors, eventually it's going to break loose just through the process of decomposition. And this makes it hard to kind of frame this. So, you know, I think that there is possible evidence that he did do this, in fact, but to try to make it stick and try to understand particularly the hydrological characteristics of this environment, coupled with the decomposition of her remains and those of the baby as well, is a really uphill battle.
And on top of the fact that the defense in their appeal really highlights that the testimony of this hydrologist from the prosecution was improper. Lara, I want to ask you a question because we might hear it tonight, and I was hoping you could explain it. A part of the defense says it was wrong that they weren't allowed to introduce evidence about the boat's stability, and that it was also unfair that the defense couldn't gain access to the boat with the state prosecutors. They had to always be there. Can you explain what this argument is? I mean, is the idea that this boat could...
long aluminum boat, and it was the same spot, same time that the prosecution was theorizing this had happened, and there was a mannequin that had the same weight as Lacey, and this individual tried to push the mannequin weighted down by 4 anchors into push it overboard, and guess what happened? The boat capsized. So what we were trying to show was that this could not have happened. Scott could not have done it. Not in that boat, not in this place, not the way the prosecution is theorizing. And of course, the judge wouldn't allow that. And the worst part of it was, not only did the judge exclude that evidence, but the judge, but during the closing argument, the prosecution argued about how, and pointed out how the defense had not brought in any type of evidence to show the instability of the boat. Now you put these two together, plus the defense was never allowed to be near the boat without the prosecution's presence. Put all of those together, it gives you a very strong argument that this was an unfair trial, that this was evidence that should have been brought in, that the defense's hands were tied. We couldn't even show that this was unstable. The jury had been able to jump in it. That was allowed. Of course, they stopped them at some point, but we had not been able to do that. When we recreated it, that wasn't allowed in.
Yeah, and the defense has clearly brought that up in their appeal about how improper it was for the jury to do that. Joseph, before we go, because I know we have to let you go, I want to ask your opinion about this is an interesting point, and it's brought up a lot, that the evidence of the body suggests perhaps Laci was dumped after the time prosecutors say, after the time police say. If you look at how old possibly Connor was, that there were these abrasions or bumps or skin damage to Laci to suggest she was in the water at a different time. The evidence you've seen, does it support that she was possibly placed there at a later date, indicating that it wasn't Scott Peterson, perhaps somebody else?
That's a very difficult determination to make. I got to tell you, from a forensic pathology standpoint, it's very difficult to make those determinations given the fact that her body was in such an advanced state of decomposition. Again, that's what all of this hinges on. You know, do you have the ability to bring this forward and demonstrate this? And I'm talking about the prosecution in an effective manner, because she was, let's face it, in an advanced state of decomposition. So I don't know that that could ever actually be determined, kind of like her cause of death.
Right, and that became a big issue because there's a lack of this direct evidence. There's a lack of forensic evidence tying Scott Peterson ultimately to the death of Laci Peterson and their unborn son, Connor. Lara, Joseph, I know we have to sign you both out. This was a great conversation, really interesting. It just shows the level of how people view this evidence in different light, and people will continue to have a conversation about it. But we do appreciate you both taking the time. Now, when we come back, Michael Bryan and I, we're going to dissect a little bit more of the defense's argument in a big issue. And Michael, I know, has some exhibits here to show us. And the exhibits are to show what was the pretrial publicity, because the defense is arguing, and I'm sure we're going to hear this tonight, is that this case should have been moved, that this trial should have been moved from San Mateo to Los Angeles. It would have been much fairer to have it there. But their motion for a venue change was denied by the court. That was improper. So we talk about how much publicity was there in this case, but really, did it have an effect on the verdict? We're going to talk about it. Plus, when we come back, we're going to have Harvey